Hi there, A2 students. I hope you're well. And in this video, we're going to see what happens to the demand for inferior goods when the price of an inferior good, let's say, falls. So if the price of X, which is an inferior good, falls, and you all know what inferior goods are, these are those goods whose demand basically goes down when real income goes up and whose demand goes up when real income goes down. So let's say if the price of good X goes down and you have an inferior good, which is a cheaper quality good, let's say, and we're talking about inferior goods that are non-Giffen, right? We're talking about a non-Giffen inferior good. So if the price of these inferior goods goes down, we know that the law of demand still holds for inferior good. There's an inverse relation. So the quantity of good X will go up. Now, indifference analysis teaches us that how much of the quantity would go up due to the substitution effect and how much would go up because of the income effect. If both are working in the same direction, let's assume, for instance. So we can find that out through the indifference analysis, which Marshall's utility theory failed to do so, right? Which is one of the limitations as well. That's why modern demand theories like indifference analysis was much better, and which you obviously mention in your evaluation as well for utility theory. Anyways, coming back, if the price of inferior good goes down, the quantity of inferior good goes up, and let's see how much is due to the substitution and how much is, and let's see how the substitution effect and how the income effect works here. So basically what happens is that when the quantity of good X goes up, what happens is that first there are two effects that happen due to the fall in price. So whenever the price goes down, whenever the price goes down for good X, your good X becomes relatively cheaper. In relative terms, it becomes cheaper to good Y. So what happens is that you substitute good X, let's say, for good Y, and this is basically the substitution effect. So the substitution effect says that when the price of good X goes down, you will consume more of good X because good X becomes relatively cheaper than good Y, while the other good Y might become relatively expensive. Although the absolute prices has not changed for good Y, but in relative terms it becomes expensive. So while for good X the good X becomes relatively cheaper, so you substitute X for Y. Substituting X for Y means you buy more of X and less of Y. So that means that if, let's say, this was your quantity, let's say you were consuming 10 units of inferior good, and so what you'll do is that when the inferior good becomes cheaper, you will basically buy more inferior goods. So you're like, oh, you know what, I am gonna buy, let's say, 16 inferior goods now because they have gotten cheaper. So the substitution effects say, yeah, come on, man, you know what, now let's buy 16 inferior goods. And this is all due to the substitution effect, which is basically positive here because you're buying more inferior goods. But here comes the bad guy, inferior goods, and that is the income effect. Income effect tells the substitution effect, oh, you know what, you need to hang on and calm down, let me bring my views in my role here as well. I want to pitch in my role here as well as too. And what income effect does is, the income effect tells us that as far as inferior goods are concerned, whenever the price of inferior good goes down, the real incomes go up because the good becomes cheaper now, so real income goes up and the purchasing power goes up for the consumer. The consumer feels richer, and if the consumer feels richer, he wouldn't buy these inferior, poor quality goods. He would go for superior goods, right? So the income effect says that, you know what, I have now gotten richer and I ain't gonna buy 16 units of inferior good. So if I'm not going to buy 16 units of inferior good, why should I buy 16 units of inferior good? Let's buy less inferior goods now. Instead of buying 16 units of inferior good, I would be maybe buying, let's say, only 14 units of inferior good, not 16 units. But the substitution effect was saying, no, we'll buy 16, but the income effect says, no, we'll only buy 14, which means that the quantity of the inferior goods that will be bought will be only 14, which means that there is a movement to the left, which means that there's a negative income effect here. And the reason is that this consumer will be saying, why? I mean, I've been consuming inferior goods all my life, so why should I even consume more inferior goods now when I feel richer now, my purchasing power has gone up, so he'll consume more superior goods right now, right? So the quantity of inferior goods that should have gone up because of the substitution effect will not go up to the extent that it would have had the income effect been reinforced, had the income effect reinforced the substitution effect. But here the income effect is partially offsetting the substitution effect and saying, you know what, let's consume two units less of inferior goods. Maybe we could buy some superior quality goods instead, right? So here we notice that a substitution effect is basically negative and partially offsets the income effect is negative and it partially offsets the substitution effect. So what we see is that if the price of good X is falling, the substitution effect is positive because you're buying more inferior goods, but you aren't buying, but the income effect kicks in and the income effect says we're going to buy less inferior goods now. So the income effect is negative here. Although what we notice is that if we compare it to our initial point, we were consuming 10 units and we still end up consuming more units from before, so which means that the total effect, or the price effect which you also call it, is still positive here. And the reason it's still positive is that although the income effect said that we'll consume less inferior goods, but it's not that we are consuming two less inferior goods, or it's not that we are consuming lesser inferior goods from our initial starting point. So in total, we are consuming more inferior goods after a price fall, which means that a substitution effect is still more than the income effect, which means that the income effect has only partially offset the substitution effect. So that is it for now, guys. And if you want me to also give the explanation for this concept on a diagram where I can break it down on the indifference curve, on the indifference analysis, how do we draw this diagram and how do we bifurcate or decompose the income effect? How do we decompose the price effect into income and substitution effect? I want you to do 2 things. Let me know in the comments and share this video with all your A2 friends so that they also know this concept. Until then, take care and follow for more.